Iroh is every millennial's wise uncle. Even as a kid watching the original run of ATLA, I was struck by his avuncular charm and evocative use of metaphors to punctuate his wisdom. He always knew the right thing to do and the best way to communicate his knowledge. He's basically a saint to us, a character of myth. He's Iroh. He's perfect. Except, he isn't perfect, is he? Because if he was, Zuko wouldn't have been a villain until halfway through season 3. But don't cancel break just yet, because I think that Iroh's imperfections are a really compelling factor in the drama of Avatar. Let's begin with the beginning, by which I mean pretty close to the end. In the second half of season 3, we see a flashback of an interaction between Iroh and a 13-year-old Zuko just a week after his banishment. Iroh gently advises Zuko to open his heart to the possibility that his father's command of capturing the Avatar may not be the only way to restore his honor. By the time we first meet Iroh and Zuko a full 3 years later, Iroh seems to have more or less accepted Zuko's unacceptable behavior. He defers to him, even when he abuses his crew and terrorizes a village of children and old people, and generally coaches him on the best ways to capture the Avatar. So, what's up with this? We know that Iroh has revolutionary aspirations. By the time we meet him in The Boy and the Iceberg, he's been a member of the White Lotus for many years, and he's long since lied to the entire Fire Nation about having killed the last of the dragons. We know he doesn't want Aang to be captured. The Avatar is the bridge between the human world and the spirit world, and we all saw the way he reacted when the moon spirit was killed. So why is he going along with his nephew's fascist bullshit? It almost seems like Iroh just gave up on Zuko. This is fascinating and deeply frustrating to watch. Throughout the beginning of season 2, when we learn that Ozai has basically put a hit out on Zuko, we just want Iroh to grab him by the collar and shake him. And then he does. And it's the biggest mistake of his life. Toward the season 2 finale, Iroh finally breaks down and yells at Zuko, spelling it out for him that he has been acting without thinking for far too long. Both in the sense that he doesn't know who he is, and that his thoughtless actions are going to get him killed. He yells. This is the loudest Mako's voice gets in the entire show. He almost sounds like Aku for a second. Wonder why? Oh, by the way, this is a weird thing that I noticed. There's a Dai Li agent that Iroh captures in, I think, like the episode before Crossroads of Destiny, or some, maybe the Crossroads of Destiny. And for years, this random Dai Li agent has had a voice that I thought was so familiar. And finally, rewatching the episode for like the 50th time, I realized it was Samurai Jack. It was Phil LaMarr. Phil LaMarr is in Avatar. Samurai Jack is in the Avatar universe, and he's a Dai Li agent. What the fuck? He sounds so bitter and fed up. You hear all the frustration that's been building up for 3 years. And Zuko hears it too, and it has a very strange effect on him. Zuko abandons his most recent attempt to capture the Avatar to restore his honor. This causes Zuko to fall into what Iroh calls a metamorphosis. He has vivid hallucinations and dreams that draw upon his fractured mental state. Iroh explains this to Zuko by telling him that he is in conflict between 2 different parts of himself. But to be in conflict with oneself is to earnestly set 2 thoughts or ideas against each other, allowing them to duel it out until a synthesis is reached. This can't be done if someone has their finger on the scale. When Iroh tells him that he is going to emerge as a better person, the person that he was meant to be, he tips that scale. Who was it that said just one episode prior that Zuko needs to look into himself to find out who he wants to be? Why is Iroh now telling Zuko what that choice should be and what it means and why it's the right one? This explanation by Iroh is followed by Zuko experiencing a dream where Aang's face is superimposed on his body. It's horrifying. I hate looking at it. Make it stop. I'm sick. So that's why my voice sounds like shit. This isn't Zuko becoming who he was meant to be, it's him becoming someone else in response to what he perceives as a judgmental, angry authority figure shaming him for who he is. What we've just seen is a dissonance between what Iroh tells Zuko and what he shows him through his actions. He literally tells him to choose for himself, but does so in a way that prompts Zuko to choose whatever he thinks Iroh wants to see in him. It's kind of ugly to imagine that, as well-meaning as Iroh was, Zuko perceives him as mirroring the actions of his father. When Zuko emerges from his metamorphosis as a good-natured little cinnamon roll who initiates hugs and willingly makes tea, he clearly isn't being authentic. That's not to say that he's being insincere. I think he genuinely wants to be this caricature that he's putting on. But it takes like 60 seconds of prodding by Azula to do something stupid and reckless again.
Come on! You'll be fine!
No! I'm tired of running. It's time I faced Azula.
When he joins the gang, when he does actually become a good guy, we see that he's just as irascible, rash, and sarcastic as he was before he changed over to the good guys. It may have been heartbreaking, both for fans and for Iroh, but it's not a surprise when a particularly juicy opportunity falls into Zuko's lap in the Season 2 finale, and he reverts right back to his old self. No substantive change has taken place. Iroh didn't teach him anything by holding his hand through his metamorphosis. Of course, what's an Iroh to do? He spent 3 years trying to give Zuko the space he needed to figure his shit out, and he just couldn't do it. And then, when he tries to take a more active stance in Zuko's internal conflict, Zuko shuts down. Like, literally passes out. Like, literally, I can't have this discussion, I'm gonna dramatically faint. And break a vase in your rented apartment. Try to get your security deposit back now. I think this characterizes Zuko so well. It's such a subtle thing, but the way this very gentle nudge by Iroh completely shakes his reality really shows you just how fragile he is until the very end of the series. It reminds me a bit of complex PTSD, where triggers to traumatic events are so subtle or even unpredictable that it can be difficult to know how to avoid provoking them. But this is fantastic for Iroh's characterization too. Iroh can be most accurately described as a passive facilitator of Zuko's bad behavior. He allows for it and even tries to help him achieve his bad goals. And, if you want to go back even further than that, as the first son of the prior Fire Lord, he sure didn't do much to get his throne back from his weird little brother. I think this is a good thing to explore. We see in flashbacks in Zuko Alone that Iroh used to be just a normal Fire Nation foot soldier, until the death of his son completely shook him to his core and left him in a state of questioning complacency. I assume that this was a period of intense reflection and little action for Iroh, hence why he didn't try to get the throne back from Ozai. I imagine that it was during this period that Iroh began communing with spirits and going into the spirit world, literally removing himself from the human world that he was so intimately involved in ruining. In the series finale, when Iroh actually liberates Ba Sing Se, fights for the side of balance and peace, it's as much a resolution of his character arc as everyone else's. Maybe Iroh, for all his kind-heartedness and wisdom, really just doesn't know how to help Zuko with his change, because it's still something he's struggling with himself. For Iroh, it took the horrific death of his son and withdrawal from the world. But for Zuko, it took making the same mistake over and over again until he finally realized that the thing he thought he wanted wasn't his real destiny. Their journeys are very different, because their lives and characters are very different. This painful miscommunication between Iroh and Zuko really demonstrates the persistent problem of empathy, and the impenetrable walls between us that make even our best of intentions dangerous. God, I am very shiny. Have I been this shiny the whole time? Just blasting a light directly at my face? Some people like to glow for the gods. I like to glow greater than the gods. By the way, I have almost 2 decades of Avatar: The Last Airbender thoughts jammed into my brain, and I can basically make videos like this forever, so if that's something you want to see, please let me know. I challenge you to an Agni Kai. First person to hit the subscribe button wins. Bye! I gotta admit that in the aftermath of my last video about some of Iroh's mistakes, I was a little bit shook at the 20% dislike ratio. I guess that it was a little bit more controversial than I thought. I certainly didn't mean to offend anybody. I love Iroh very much. It was clearly offensive to some people, and I just wanted to say, before we get started, that I'm really, really, really excited to tell you all about why The Great Divide is the best 22 minutes of television ever. That'll get the likes back. No, that's not quite true, but seriously, it's a lot better than you think. The Great Divide follows Aang as he tries to get 2 tribes who utterly hate each other to get over a canyon without killing each other. And the canyon is called The Great Divide. The canyon is a metaphor. People dislike this episode for having a simplistic plot, not tying into the main story, and generally feeling kind of boring, but I think it's a good time. There's some experimentation with the animation style, a clever resolution to the immediate obstacle, some funny jokes.
Maybe you Zhangs wouldn't have so many sick people if you weren't such slobs.
If you Ganjins weren't so clean, maybe you wouldn't live to be so old.
And as expected, fantastic original music. But by far, the most serious critique of this episode has to do with the resolution of the central problem. The Great Divide ends with Aang getting these two warring nations to make peace, probably saving all their lives and making them a more stable people as a result. But he does it by lying. One of the most common responses to this episode is that it's completely out of character for Aang to lie. Why would a monk, who theoretically works to achieve enlightenment by pursuing the fundamental truths of the universe, ever lie to solve a problem? Well, the thing is, Aang's character extends outside his status as a monk, and Aang as a fully rounded character has no problem lying. He lies to get into Omashu, he spends a good chunk of Season 3 pretending he's a Fire Nation colonial named Kuzan, and he even lies to the gang about having mastered the Avatar state in the Season 2 finale. What's more, Aang is pretty unambiguously doing the right thing here, both from the point of view of the characters inside the narrative, and from the point of view of the writers living in our world. Like, if we'd really ended that episode with that coincidental story about the kids playing the game of redemption, we all would have been far more annoyed with it. We would have called it the lion turtle effect, a complete deus ex machina. Within the story, Aang is actually being very practical here. These two tribes are completely unwilling to hear each other out, and when Aang tells this story, they are in the middle of fighting to the death. Aang can't spend the rest of his life following these idiots around to make sure that they don't genocide each other. With Aang's revision of a history that has clearly already been corrupted, he resolves the immediate conflict, prevents them from killing each other on the road when he turns his back, and makes them more resilient to any potential Fire Nation soldiers that they come across on their travels. But I'm not just going to stop there. I don't just think that Aang lying about the source of the enmity between the two tribes is completely consistent with his character. I actually think that this is the best part of the episode because it's so deeply illustrative and revealing about his character. There's this little thing that we all forget about Aang when looking at his character arc, and the reason for that is unfortunate. As fantastic as the writing in this show often is, Aang's character arc kind of falls flat just before the finish line. You must see that, right? I would make a video dissecting that in full, but luckily that video already exists. And it's a lot better than anything I can come up with, I assure you. And it has a great title. Sneezy Reviews Get In Losers Were Standing Zutara says just about everything I've ever wanted to say about Aang's arc so well. When I said Codex Entry's Pathologic videos were tied for some of my favorite videos on YouTube, I was very much thinking about this little number. Sneezy is very thorough and articulate and is also just a really funny editor. Great video, go watch it. But I'll just elaborate on one point. It's easy to forget what Aang's full arc was originally set up to be because we really don't get a resolution to it by the end of the series. Aang likes to approach things from a different angle, which sometimes means coming up with a quick and clever solution in a catch-22. But sometimes it means get out of doing something difficult. He knows this about himself, and says as much in the series finale, which is why he can't accept the fact that he should be preparing to kill the Fire Lord. He's Aang. There must be a way out of this. At the end of Season 2, Aang is told by Guru Patik that he has to let go of his love for Katara. Our man Iroh gives him conflicting advice, saying that power is overrated and love is more important. But that's another one of Iroh's mistakes. Because Aang is the Avatar, and he needs the power to stop the Earth Kingdom from being razed to the ground, and the rest of the world after it. Aang points this out to Iroh, and Iroh is like, oh, yeah, okay, no, that's true. Luckily, we get a steel-manned version of Iroh's argument in the series finale, when Yang Chen tells us that the Avatar cannot achieve enlightenment, cannot remove themselves from the world, because their duty is to the world. Attachment is part of the deal, so Aang is caught between two seemingly true and yet contradictory claims. You must let go of attachment, you must not let go of attachment. What the show ends up choosing is a watered-down slush of all these possibilities. The lion turtle is a deus ex machina, falling on the rock to trigger the avatar state is a deus ex machina, etc. Though Big Joel actually defends those choices in a pretty interesting way, it doesn't get over the fact that it still feels very contrived. We don't learn how Aang has changed into the kind of person that can be the avatar, just that his spirit is composed of steadfast goodness. Sneezy offers what I see as a perfect solution to this. One could imagine an iteration of this ending where Aang neither continues to be in love with Katara, but nor does he let go of her. Yes, as you can tell by the title, Sneezy is advocating for a Zutara ending, and I know that that is a crime punishable by death throughout the fandom, but they happen to be correct. Instead, he lets go of his illusion of Katara. Katara is a human being, capable of great anger and grief, and even cruelty, as all humans are. She's not this perfect, compassionate, motherly idol that he's held her up as since he was thawed out of the iceberg. So, wouldn't it be interesting if Aang literally let go of his attachment to Katara, not Katara herself? He would realize that he was actually in love with a very narrow sliver of her that he gets from their unique relationship, where she coddles him and nurtures him and acts kinda like his mother. That unique relationship that they share is not indicative of Katara's entire personality. And in doing that, he wouldn't just be letting go of an attachment. He would be choosing to shatter an illusion, a fabrication, a lie. In this way, Aang would have concluded his arc by doing what Aang does, which is find the third way out, solve the problem by looking at it from a new angle. But he would also overcome his internal conflict by not evading the issue. In fact, it would take great courage and self-wisdom to acknowledge that kind of thing, to admit that his love was based on an illusion. It's a great idea, and I'd argue even the correct ending of Avatar. It just so happens that the show chooses the wrong ending. I could lament the problems with this conclusion for hours and hours, but the fact is that those of you who agree with me could easily see someone give voice to their opinions by watching Sneezy's video, and those of you who disagree have already left a comment saying, "You got baited, get over it, lel," and clicked off the video to go watch drama YouTube or whatever it is you people do. So, let's get back to The Great Divide. The Great Divide is the 11th episode of Season 1. Episode 12 of Season 1 is The Storm. In The Storm, we see flashbacks to Aang running away from the Southern Air Temple amidst apprehensions and fears about being the Avatar. In the next 100 years of his absence, the world is plunged into suffering and chaos. Running away is not only Aang's biggest regret, it is his internal character flaw. Aang doesn't solve problems, he runs away from them. Throughout the first season, Aang's anxieties about stepping into the responsibilities of being the Avatar are flanked by loss. Loss of childhood, loss of his home, loss of Gyatso. Everything Aang believes that he destroyed with his inaction seems to feed off his grief. Later on, after Aang has taken on so many responsibilities, come into his role as a protector and a mediator for the nations, the weight of his guilt bears down on him full force. The beginning of Season 3 sees him tormented by the idea that his best course of action is keeping his head down and doing nothing. Knowing this, of course, a mid-Season 1 Aang feels comfortable lying to create peace. His aversion to facing problems head-on is repeated and chronic.
You don't have to do this for me. I can find another teacher.
I'm not doing it for you.
No, she's not blaming you.
No, I'm blaming her. I'll be outside if you're man enough to fight me.
I'm sure she didn't mean that.
Yeah, I think she did.
I think The Great Divide is perfectly placed to reveal Aang's full range of tactics, everything he's willing to do to avoid conflict. Right before, we see just how prominent this threat has been throughout his life. To be absolutely clear, Aang is not at all responsible for the genocide of his people. As Katara points out, even if they had known that the Fire Nation was about to attack all of the air temples, Aang probably would have been murdered with the rest of the air nomads if he had been there. But what's more important than whether Aang is actually responsible for it or not is how it makes Aang feel. Aang is a child, and the full weight of the responsibility that he has arbitrarily been assigned often makes him feel really guilty.
I can't fight them all.
But you have to. You're the Avatar.
I'm just one kid.
He feels a child's impulse to somehow avoid this responsibility. But the right of a child to not have to deal with these kinds of issues was taken away from him, and he has to use his very limited experience with the world to somehow try and save it. In this world of adults who are constantly trying to kill each other for the stupidest little reasons, are willing to inflict mass misery and pain and suffering, who seem to look for reasons not to trust each other, to stab each other in the back, we have one kid who's trying to pull it all together. In this moment in a canyon, Aang starts to learn how to save the world. I'm on an Avatar hot take kick. Zuko often gets accolades for being one of the best written characters in all of television, but the older I get, the more affected, inspired, and entertained I am by Katara. So I'm just gonna lay down my hot take up front. Katara is the best character in the show, and anyone who finds her mean or shrill or hysterical probably just has unresolved issues with brown women, and maybe women in general. Forgive me if this sounds overly confrontational, but for almost 2 decades now, this fictional teenage girl has received so much hate for the exact reasons that I find her so lovable. Her depth of feeling, her frank observations of the world around her, her relentlessly positive framing of the world. There are so many just effusively cruel Katara haters littered around the internet. People who think she's overly emotional, mean, hysterical, any list of adjectives that's applied to just about any leading female character. And I just don't think you're really a fan of Avatar if you hate the thematic and emotional linchpin of the show. Katara brings us into the story, introducing the war through her lens. She is the quintessence of Avatar. The many implications of the war on normal people are reflected in her goals and backstory. Her tireless effort to not just survive her trauma and pain, but to derive inspiration from it. She is the embodiment of compassion and trust, and is the truest expression of children's media's fixation on friendship. Her martial arts are also visually engrossing, and she's just freaking hilarious.
The stars sure are beautiful tonight. Too bad you can't see them, Toph. I'm Kwame, and this is...
It's what she deserves.
dung. A giant-eared cretin! Look at those things! Do herds of animals use them for shade?
But it must be said that Katara's story is not perfectly integrated into the larger series. While it certainly looks like it's going to be, her story in the end is rendered exterior to the thematic aims of the piece. And if you've seen my last video about Aang's internal struggle, you may see where I'm going with this. Please don't click off the video. The big damn kiss at the end of Avatar is not just bad for Aang's arc, it also takes a big steaming dump on one of the best characters ever drawn. There is a tag on Tumblr called Anti-Breik. Breik is an amalgamated name between Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, the 2 creators of Avatar, and so we just jammed them together and we make Breik. It's not a ship name, but it should be. Katara is a particular subject of interest within the anti-Breik community. Generally, posters in this tag critique how the show chooses to frame and discuss issues, usually from an intersectional feminist viewpoint, which almost always comes down to how Katara is treated by the text. One tag that commonly intersects with anti-Breik posts are Po-Katara posts. Po/Katara, the panda from Kung Fu Panda. Hot. A panda lily, a rare panda lily. Hashtag pro-Katara commonly overlaps with anti-Breik posts. For some reason, these posts don't really focus on Toph that much. I guess I'm not the only person who assumed that Toph is not a binary girl.
I sound like a guy. A really buff guy.
Well, Toph, what you hear up there is the truth. It hurts, doesn't it?
Are you kidding me? I wouldn't have cast it any other way.
I should say, I don't agree with the severity of a lot of these posts, but goddamn, they are cathartic to read. What I love about these posts is that they sometimes almost seamlessly fit in with the text itself. That's not to say that the criticisms aren't warranted, they're usually spot on. But what I mean is, when watching the show in 2024, we'd probably assume that Breik agreed with these criticisms too. Like, one common point of discussion is the episode The Southern Raiders, like, duh, during which Katara comes across as the darkest version of herself. Unlike the rest of the show, where Katara protects the feelings of others, nurtures her friends, and keeps her outlook optimistic and productive, here she is angsty, assertive, and a bit mean. It seems at first like the show is going to punish her for wanting revenge, and taking Appa without permission, and telling Sokka he didn't love their mother as much as she did. Aang's and Sokka's objections to her behavior, and their insistence on forgiveness, and the condescending and entitled tone with which they tell Katara, the ultimate bearer of the gang's emotional labor, to suck it up and move on, are treated as noble and good and righteous. I'm sorry. Clearly, I'm still mad at them. But in the end, the episode isn't about punishing Katara for pursuing her needs. She is given a position of moral authority in the end, where she passes judgment on Zuko and fully accepts him as a friend and a redeemed person. She conclusively tells Aang that he was wrong and she regrets nothing. She offers no apologies and she ends up happier for it. And she effectively gets the last word in the episode when Zuko confronts Aang with his own capacity for violence. Katara is never even prompted to reflect upon the deeply cutting response she makes to Sokka at the top of the episode. Hurtful though it may be, the show seems to allow for the fact that Katara doesn't need to apologize. In some way, this line reflects a truth that Katara really needs to vocalize. By the way, I really don't think that Sokka is blameless in this interaction. He doesn't just say, "she was my mother too," because it's a thought that sprang into his head apropos of nothing. He says it to silence and insult Katara, to get her to back down. But Katara just kind of states the obvious. And you know what? If Sokka gets to have a special relationship with their father...
Someone has to stay here with the Earth King and help him plan for the invasion. I guess that's me.
No, Sokka. I know how badly you want to help Dad. You go to Chameleon Bay. I'll stay here with the king.
You are the nicest sister ever!
Then it should be evident and completely fair that Katara has a special relationship with their mother. I mean, they were two women living in a deeply patriarchal society, and Kaya's death kind of signals the end of Katara's childhood. Yeah, it's possible that Kaya's death affected Katara more than Sokka, and trying to draw up some equivalence between what Sokka and Katara are going through, and just saying that as though that should be enough to get Katara to do whatever you want, like, it's a little messed up, Sokka. Maybe you can't prescribe what their healing process should look like. I don't feel like Katara is being mean in this interaction. She's correctly observing the differences in the three different characters' kinds of grief, and advocating for her needs with passion, and refusing to back down when men try to insult her. You know? Maybe that's okay. A similar thing happens with the two forced kisses that Aang does to Katara before the last episode. A worse show might try to hint that Katara is into being kissed by Aang, but in the first instance, she seems bemused and embarrassed, and in the second she rightfully yells at him and storms away. So someone behind the scenes of Avatar seems to have realized that Katara is battling sexism throughout the entire run of the show, mostly from her friends and allies. You'd think that the showrunners would, I don't know, try to give that some kind of resolution. Show her overcoming the obstacle of constantly being stereotyped and put into a role with radical authenticity and self-knowledge. Maybe. But no. All this poignant and intelligent writing does is make it so much more frustrating and vexing and stunning in the very end of the show, when Katara is written into a relationship with the one main character in the series who hasn't learned a damn thing about who she is. Seriously, both Toph and Sokka have moments where they express deep affection and appreciation for who she is, beyond her capacity as a parental surrogate.
I'm coming too.
I thought you didn't want to help.
You need me, and I will never turn my back on you.
Zuko absolutely shines in the Southern Raiders, seeking her out to get yelled at, actually listening to what she says, thinking about what it means, and offering to bring her to Yan Ra and back her up. No conditions, no speeches, just a willingness to understand and be supportive. Aang, on the other hand, has completely broken down under the weight of Katara's full character. The two have never been more at odds than when Katara has been at her most authentic and uninhibited and vulnerable. So how is this relationship a good ending for Katara? At this point, there's just no use hiding it. I have a very personal relationship with what I see as a profoundly bleak ending for a character I really love and resonate with. Romance isn't everything, and sometimes romance isn't even anything. And who you date when you're 14 won't necessarily affect the quality of the rest of your life. But marrying your first boyfriend, and that marriage defining your political engagement for the rest of your life, severing your ties with the activism and politics that you were so passionate about as a teenager, that kind of is everything. Katara is not said to have had any presence in the political history of Republic City or any other part of the world after the main series. According to her daughter, Aang's death left her broken and isolated, and her own children and the world around her is far more concerned with her partner's heritage being preserved than her own. She was also the last Bender of the Southern Water Tribe. What about her culture? Doesn't that need to be preserved? Katara's life didn't go the way I wanted it to, and that's so unfair. Sometimes I wonder if DeMartino and Konietzko knew just how painfully real Katara is, how engaging and empowering and nuanced she is, the way her story just sucks you in a very visceral way, and how betrayed I felt when her story was undone like that. And I'm not just saying that as a person who knows that Zutara would have objectively made for a better ending. And by objectively, I mean subjectively, as in rooted in the subject, being me, who has observed and processed the art correctly. From Kant to Sontag, we all agree that subjective doesn't mean that every interpretation is grounded or reflects taste as equal in quality to anyone else's. Some readings are better than others, and a proper reading of this text points to the ending being all wrong. But I feel this need to explain the effect that this writing decision has had on me, because they're so much bigger and darker and more fatalistic than just a ship sinking at the last minute. They're systemic. This ending hurts in a way that, frankly, a lot of cis men don't seem capable of understanding. In my last video, I went off on a little tangent about a video made by Sneezy Reviews. In it, the essayist demonstrates as conclusively as possible that Zutara would have made for the most aesthetically correct iteration of this story. And they also have a really fantastic video about Katara and the Southern Raiders, which also really influenced this video. And since I watched these two videos, I've not been able to get the topic off my mind, which is why I've made 3 Avatar videos in a stretch. Sneezy's video concludes with a statement on the visceral and long-lasting wrongness of Avatar's ending, which is the appropriate reaction to a piece of art not becoming the thing it was supposed to be. But my feeling is perhaps less appropriate. I'm angry. Not as just some viewer with no past or inductive relationship to the story, but as someone who is, in a very rigid, unfair, and oppressive sense, a woman. I'm not a woman, and I just want to warn you up front that I'm about to go on a rant that might read to some people as sort of gender essentialist. I'm hoping that you can give me some grace on this one, because the tentacles of patriarchy weave their influence into every moment I spend interacting with society, and they have relentlessly categorized me as a woman, even though I'm not one. And I would be very obviously lying if I said that these oppressive influences have not aligned me with womanhood, as much in solidarity as in empathy. So please forgive the slight inaccuracy, but within the narrow limits of this video, I am a woman. And I'm hurt by what I see as something wrong having been done to Katara, as well as to me, and all the other girls that watched the ending unfold the way it did. The big damn kiss at the end of Avatar between Katara and Aang really never fails to make me a bit ill. In my viewings of the show, the finale ends with Toph making the whole gang laugh. Power of friendship, the end. I'm not saying that Katara doesn't love Aang, but let's be real here. A large part of her immediate feelings of care and love for him have to do with the fact that he represents a possible eventual ending of the war that has more or less destroyed the early part of her life. Let's go through Katara's story, because it's one of the best written arcs in the entire show. Katara spends the first few moments of the show insecure about her use of bending to catch a fish, but still doing her best to provide for her family. After Sokka says something sexist, she becomes really mad because, yeah, shut up, Sokka. Katara is clearly the homemaker, seems like she might also be the breadwinner, and the one thing she's proud of is constantly being ridiculed by her brother. She blows up at him and explains her situation very clearly. Being forced to be a parent at a very young age, particularly because of her gender and the culture she comes from, as well as the tragic death of her mother and the subsequent abandonment of her father, has left her feeling trapped, stifled, and uncared for. Then Aang comes along, and while he's falling in love at first sight, Katara is inspired by the fact that the Avatar is alive. Therefore the war might end soon, therefore her father might come home, and then she won't have to be a parent anymore. Not that she has any conscious desire to be a kid again, she already seems to think her childhood is gone. But over the first season, she pretty explicitly cares for Aang, coddles him, helps him keep his spirits up and his temper under control, because mothering Aang is how Katara initially thinks she can participate in ending the war.
Aang is the Avatar. He's the world's only chance. You both found him for a reason. Now your destinies are intertwined with his.
Since she was 8 years old, she's been a caretaker. This is just a form of that role that actually has an endgame and isn't a life sentence like it has been. She sees watching over Aang and getting to the North Pole as an expression of her desire for peace.
Your mission is to take back your home. Ours is to get Aang to the North Pole.
It's her form of activism. This starts to shift when she fights her way to the North Pole and realizes that she loves martial arts. She doesn't just have to be the requisite healer for the group, she can fight. In Imprisoned, which is probably the best episode of Season 1, Katara's determination and bravery and cunning all pull her into the spotlight. Her good qualities are praised rather than being expected as they are in her role as a nurturer. She can be on the front line, she can demand recognition, fight for a cause. She can demand care in the form of learning from Pakku. Her journey throughout Season 2 sees her continuing to develop as a warrior and a political agent, all while continuing to be the heart of the group. Something we learn about Katara throughout the first 2 seasons is that she is a deeply optimistic person. She trusts people and is quick to form connections. She assumes the best in them. And one way she connects is through empathy, through the festering wound where the memory of her mother lives. This development comes to a head when she has her first real conversation with Zuko. For the first time, we see her initiate a hostile interaction. She begins yelling at him before he even does anything to her or one of her friends. And for the first time, she brings up the death of her mother as an explosion of grief and anger and sadness, rather than as a means of connecting with someone. But she's amazed to find out that it has that effect anyway. She does make a connection. Zuko isn't offended by Katara's rage and pain and aggression. He's capable of being very receptive to her in these states. Maybe connection and compassion don't have to come with being parental and self-sacrificing. Maybe Katara can be her kind self while being authentic and vulnerable. And maybe supporting her side of the war isn't such a cut and dry issue, and she has to follow her own instincts and intellect. Remember that this conversation directly contributes to Zuko turning over to the good guys. Part of the reason Zuko is so anxious about staying in the palace is that he knows Katara was probably able to save Aang because of this conversation. And if that's happened, Zuko is in deep shit. So Katara's openness and compassion is a very tangible factor in Zuko's switch to the good side. In Season 3, Katara completely comes into her own. The first episode of the season, The Awakening, shows Katara at her most unguarded during a conversation with her father about how lost and hurt she was after he left. The episodes The Puppet Master and The Painted Lady show her at her most competent, confident, and independent, even as they challenge her views and values. Her journey to find her own way to contribute to the world she wants doesn't end at Aang's side. Her final contribution to the war effort actually happens because she forges a really solid friendship with her prior enemy, who then asks for her help. Not as a teacher or a mother surrogate or a healer, but as a person he can trust to handle herself and make wise decisions. Her closeness with Zuko isn't just an extremely moving way to demonstrate how far Katara has come as a person who lives for herself and expresses her truth, but also stands in contrast to just how shallow Aang's feelings for her are. Their very last conversations of the show, from Southern Raiders to Ember Island Players to Sozin's Comet, are of Aang so painfully misunderstanding her that he accuses her of wanting to kill someone, forcibly kisses her when she is very clearly uncomfortable, and then yells at her for raising her voice slightly when he starts behaving like a petulant baby. Of course, Aang is allowed to have his own internal turmoil, but like Katara's, it needs to go somewhere. It can't just be some ridiculous force that changes the story around to meet his desires. And then, in her very last seconds on screen, Katara's puppet strings are yanked on by two middle-aged white guys, and suddenly she isn't the person she had to fight to be anymore, she's this thing that the male hero deserves. It's gross. When I was a teenager, engaging on the internet with people who disagreed with his opinion, I would just get lulled down with this kind of like gross scorn that it seems to be like a thing in the Katang community. And I'm sorry if you're a nice Katanger, I'm sure there are nice Katangers, but some of the vocal ones can just be so like mean. And I was like, 13, 14, 15, I'm on the internet and I'm getting like lulled at and like kind of told to back down and be quiet. And I would sit at the computer and seethe at the men and boys who didn't seem to understand the gravity of this writing decision. There's this text called the Master-Slave Dialectic by Hegel. In it, the oppressed has more knowledge of the oppressor than vice versa, because the oppressed is able to see things from this ground floor level that, the oppressor can't see. I felt like the slave in that scenario. The men and boys on these forums thought they were just engaged in some silly, fandom shipping war, and I was the only one that could see that on the other side of the screen wasn't a shipper or a fan. They were a channel of influence beating down on me, trying to clear away that which is essential to my interactions with art and stories. My anger as a woman, my love of other women, my desire that they should be allowed to express themselves naturally. I don't think cis men get it. The betrayal and anger and despair that is inherent to the experience of being a woman under patriarchy. You see a few scattered issues and you think you understand the weight of the summation of it all. Rape culture, income inequality, beauty standards. You get rid of all that and, all will be equal. But you're building dams to hold back creeks when a monsoon is beating down on us constantly. This trauma is so innate to who I am. It's a vital part of how I read text. Katara's final decision is not hers. So obviously can I see that it is not hers. It feels viscerally like an arranged marriage. And it's just so cruel. Because it's this girl who so accurately and deeply encapsulates how it feels to be a woman living under patriarchy, bent and manipulated by the silent predatory force of a couple of creepy middle-aged men who wanted to marry her off. Yeah, it is creepy. I know it must seem strange to some people to fixate this much on a single plot point of a show that ended 16 years ago, but what I want you to take away from this video is that things like harm and oppression and influence are so much more subtle in their effects than we tend to think. And the more privilege you have in one area, the less language you have with which to discuss the nuances of another's experience. Things like microaggressions don't just come from people. They come from art and stories and anything else our young minds are fed as they grow. A lot of people who watch Avatar don't even see this side of the material. They don't get how badly and personally it hurts. And the extent of the anti-Katang, anti-Bryke, pro-Katara communities on Tumblr are a testament to the fact that I'm not the only one who picked up on this as a deeply harmful and long-lasting thing. My voice is, like, gone. Oh god. And I also want you to consider that next time you get into an argument and you want to disagree with someone's claims, maybe they are speaking with a level of authority that you just don't have. Not authority in the sense that their word should dominate overall, but maybe they have a level of expertise in a certain area because they've experienced it. And on a more grounded level, I just want you to love Katara as much as I do. Because she is so much more than the men who made her. Thanks for watching. Okay, so I'm not about to stand the new live-action version of Avatar. It had its good parts, but generally I was insulted by the fact that we have yet another direct adaptation. There's just no need for this, and I really wish Bryke had learned from 2010 that we don't want more content, we want more story. However, I did feel that the live-action Katara was a compelling iteration of the character, though she's not my Katara. Most people did not like it at all. I think a lot of people were underwhelmed with Gyo and Dio's subdued performance of the character. She doesn't come off as fiery and passionate and determined as she is in the animated series. However, while this character has little in common with Mai Katara, she is in some ways a truer adaptation at her core in comparison to the other adaptees. If you've seen my video on Katara, you might know that I just find her to be the most heroic character in the original series, and I feel like a lot of the criticisms she gets are shallow and sexist. A lot of commenters didn't agree, but, you know, it's my video. Make your own. Katara is both praised and derogated for her outspokenness, stubbornness, and commitment to her values. But part of what's so remarkable about her is that these things don't really come naturally to her, they weren't cultivated in her upbringing. She had to teach herself that justice and steadfastness were more important to her than protecting other people's feelings or being supportive. That's kind of what her arc is all about. At least until, you know, the last scene. But let's not get into that again. In the very first moments of the original series, we see that Katara generally undercuts Sokka's offensive remarks with practiced wit and calm. It isn't until he says something misogynistic that she blows up at him. A similar thing can be seen in The Chase. Katara makes multiple level-headed attempts to get Toph to share the labor of the group. It isn't until Toph makes it clear that her values do not align with Katara's, that Toph doesn't share a sense of responsibility to the group, that she gets confrontational. That and the exhaustion and Toph slamming the door in her face. Katara spends the first season trying to negotiate standing up for what she believes in and standing up for herself. She goes back and forth a lot, trying to tie her sense of justice to her need for care and recognition. but she's not yet comfortable advocating solely for herself. She has to learn to fight against her impulse to suppress her own emotions. This is why I love her conversation with Hakoda in The Awakening so much. It feels like the first time Katara really expresses grief and loneliness in a way that entirely centers herself. Katara is an overwhelmingly emotional person, the fandom is right about that. But how often does she really let those emotions out? I'd argue not nearly as much as a person who has been through what she has probably ought to. So, while her superficial character traits aren't one for one, I felt a deeper truth in Katara's live-action portrayal than, say, Zuko's or Aang's. So, this version makes adjustments in Katara's character flaw, and it mainly does this to accommodate changes in Sokka's characterization. In the original, Sokka kind of cosplays as a leader, but we get the clear impression that no real weight has been placed on his shoulders. That's actually part of his baggage. He feels like he doesn't have a place in the world, no special skill. He doesn't see himself as having some unique ability or place, and that makes him feel, not very valued. But live-action Sokka really is a leader. His arc is more about his fears that he's not a very good leader. That's why he has an overt conflict having to do with whether he sees himself as a warrior or an inventor. In the original, this was more implicit. It wasn't so much a conflict in its own right, so much as it was an introduction to his actual conflict. Wanting to feel important, but understanding himself to have no worth. All of this together means that Sokka gets the arc of breaking out of assigned roles to pursue an authentic truth, which was kind of Katara's whole thing in the original series. So, these writers tweaked Katara's internal conflict. She's no longer fighting against patriarchal forces in her life, placing her in a caregiving role. She's a sufferer of intense survivor's guilt, whose trauma blocks her ability to access her emotions and to bend, her biggest goal. She's not a parental figure anymore, and she doesn't really deal with sexism at home, so this is a necessary change here. Her arc throughout the season has to do with opening herself up to the pain of the past, so that she can channel her life force and actually waterbend effectively. That's why we actually see the death of her mother, the event Katara feels directly responsible for. She can't access this amazing, unique thing she has inside of her because of guilt. And without her father, and with her brother just being a kid, there's no one around with the ability to help her understand that her mother's death wasn't her fault. Grand is a total weirdo in this version, so I think it's fair to assume that she didn't even try. As a result, Katara feels more like she's been abandoned by her family rather than put in charge of caring for it. Animated Katara also felt isolated and alone and abandoned, but she also had a place. They've just swapped one part of her character arc for another, and changed her character traits around to match that. The rawest part of Katara's psyche is pointed in just a slightly different direction, but this has huge ramifications for how Gyo and Dio portrays her. Rather than that sense of desperate optimism and meticulous warmth animated Katara brings to every scene, live-action Katara always needs to push herself to engage with others, to be an emotional and social being. Again, it's not my Katara, but that doesn't mean that the mechanisms underpinning her character are broken, and it doesn't mean that Gyo and Dio did a bad job portraying her. Also, I gotta say, I think a lot of these criticisms continue the trend of pigeonholing Katara as, like, a natural-born caregiver. Katara is not a natural caregiver, as I talk about in my video. She's a learned caregiver. If the main thing you get from Katara is that her essential nature is to be everyone's mommy, you're just not paying attention. Whatever. As I say about Katara in my original video, her priorities are to work on a broader scale than just helping individual people. Not suffice to help some people in a derelict town, she destroys the source of their distress. She frees an entire prison rather than just the one prisoner she feels responsible for. You could say that Katara was ruined, but in the end, she's just a very different character. I feel like Gyo and Dio really shines when Katara is fighting her impulses to shut down and not share her emotions. You can tell that even discussing her desires and hopes and pain takes a lot of effort for her. Even the words are difficult to get out. But she does it, because, like the Katara we know and love, she has this innate drive to connect with other people through pain and hope. That's Katara on any level, a need for deep connection. That said, Pakku throwing her into a leadership position at the end of the season isn't empowering, it's just bizarre. She still has things to learn from him. Why are they leaving the North Pole? It doesn't make any freaking sense to me. I don't really get it. It's not a very good show, you guys. But I thought Katara was written decently, and the actor found a distinct way into Katara's mind. And I found her performance quite compelling. Now, please, don't make another season. Giuseppe Klonopin Rowling. A person with many bad qualities, but by far her worst is her inability to write a coherent, magical world. In 2018, Rowling responded to a tweet calling her out for devising an utterly stupid game called Quidditch. In Quidditch, a bunch of people fly around on brooms, getting points by throwing balls into a goal. Oh, it's a sport ball. I get it. I love a sport ball. Sport ball is my favorite. The broken part is that there's this little guy called the Golden Snitch that darts all over the stadium. Whichever team catches the Golden Snitch first gets 150 points, and then the game ends. They don't win the game just ends. So, if you're 160 points behind and your team catches the Golden Snitch, you lose. There are several times throughout the books where a team that is losing the game by more than 150 points will just catch the Golden Snitch to, lose with honor. You know, like teenage jocks often do. In response to someone telling her that this makes no sense, Giuseppe responded,
"It makes total sense. There's glamour in chasing an elusive lucky break, but teamwork and persistence can still win the day. Everyone's vulnerable to blows of fate and obstructive people, and success means rising above them. Quidditch is the human condition."
You're welcome.
Huh? No. They weren't saying that the game doesn't make symbolic sense. They were saying it makes no practical sense. And that means that all of the Quidditch matches in the books feel like a boring waste of time. I love sport ball, particularly the way it reflects the metaphysics of the incarnate soul. Am I right, fellas? Joanna Cabana Rowling is both the creator of Quidditch and also doesn't understand how Quidditch affects her story. All this to say, I am a die-hard death of the author extremist. Not only does a writer's intention not matter once a story is released to the public, a writer's intentions can straight up be wrong when they undermine the utility of the story's literary devices. There are times when a writer deserves the utmost devotion to sincere analysis on the part of their readers, and other times when they deserve an inquisition. Sometimes you find yourself asking if a story has successfully convinced you to follow in its emotional logic, or if there is a troubling dissonance that keeps you at arm's length. Today, we're going to ask which of these paths a proper analysis of the character of Azula ought to take, and how an in-depth reading of the character of Zuko can inform that analysis. They naturally demand comparison. Two siblings of opposite temperaments, one of whom rises against great odds, and the other a paragon of royalty brought down to her lowest low. We're being invited to compare the two, and we're tempted to investigate where their paths diverged. It's been almost 20 years since Zuko's pretty face made its grand debut to the world, and he's still spoken of throughout the fandom with the utmost reverence. We automatically compare any redemption arc to his, as if he was the golden standard. But not only is he a compelling character, people just seem to like him. He has to fight to be good, fight both himself and the world he was brought up in. And I think that because his trials are so insurmountable, the temptations so high and the right path so punishing, we come to trust his goodness absolutely. By Crossroads of Destiny, we're given a glimpse at just how good-hearted Zuko can be. And that's why it really hurts when we see that he hasn't actually been redeemed yet. By the finale, we have seen him successfully put in the work to prove that this transformation has stuck. And that's why, when we're trying to get our anime repulsed friends into Avatar, we tell them about Zuko. You're closer now, because the sun was out and it made everything bad. It's still making things bad, god damn it. On the other hand, Azula can be sort of difficult to talk about because there's just such a deep and cutting tragedy to her. A child, younger than most of our main cast, indoctrinated and held to unreasonable standards throughout her short life. Yet, also a dangerous political agent. If we mention her at all, it's to talk about what a ruthless, entertaining villain she is. Azula seems almost entirely irredeemable, with just a handful of moments alluding to the possibility that she has any capacity for goodness. She interacts kindly with her friends and brother approximately twice throughout the run of the show. She's given plenty of time to show some sort of humanity, she just doesn't. But in the final hour of the story, we're shown that, in fact, she was a human being the whole time. Things in her life actually have affected her, and she has goals beyond the here and now that we have not yet been invited to consider. And we're given our first and only glimpse into where she went wrong. This is the only indication we are ever given to suggest that she could have turned out differently. And it's, the finale. We are going to talk about who Azula is, but first I'd like to talk about what Azula isn't. This is important groundwork, so stick with me. I am often frustrated by a common fan interpretation of Azula as, for lack of a better term, psychopathic. We will come back to that word. You can hold me to that. The idea seems to be that Azula is so interested in power because of the pure hedonistic pleasure of it, and she doesn't care who she has to screw over to get it, or may even enjoy that aspect. What seems to follow from this are implications that she lacks some kind of basic human empathy, has only shallow emotions, no forward vision, no complex humanity. I hate this, and I also happen to think it isn't supported by the text. Let's start with why I hate it, because I really hate it. It feels like a way of stripping her character of any meaningful agency. It makes her extremely boring in hindsight, which is the opposite of what a well-written character should do. What's more, for reasons that I will get into, the idea that she is one-dimensionally cruel and entirely self-serving is deeply problematic to me, mostly for story reasons, but also for society reasons. Azula and the men who made her, my magnum opus. Why does everything have to be so political nowadays? It's just a cartoon, Snowflake. Go back to 2014 where you belong. I just finished a series on the antagonists of The Dragon Prince, and while developing my ideas, I read a lot of takes about why the villains I was interested in writing about were just so goddamn evil. This was especially true for Erebos, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the big bad of the show. Analyses of the character tended to focus on interpreting morally neutral or ambiguous actions as callously or destructively intended. For example, a villain can't simply be hurt because they feel betrayed. They must be angry because their authoritarian control over others was challenged. It often seemed like viewers took the most superficial reading of a character and recast any little bit of evidence in a needlessly dim light. Azula apologizes to Ty Lee for making her cry. That must have been a manipulative chess gambit in her plot to maintain loyalty. It felt a bit like the way some religious people cherry-pick quotes from their given holy text and spin them to convey the morals they already believe in. Like, why even read the text at that point? Might as well just go with the morals you already had. If you really don't care about characters, trying to get into their minds, understanding their motivations, that's totally valid. But maybe character analysis just isn't for you. I like talking about this shit, and that's why I'm doing it. As for my society reasons, strap in. In 1888, German psychiatrist J.L.A. Koch coined the term psychopastiche, from which we get the English term psychopath. Psychopastiche means suffering soul, and as you can imagine, that was sufficiently vague enough to cover lack of motivation, self-harm tendencies, depression, basically mental illness? Today, the term is similarly vague enough to be entirely useless. There well may be such thing as a psychopath, but the fact that it was coined 136 years ago and the term is still not in the DSM, nor is its similarly vague cousin the sociopath, we should consider the idea of a psychopath to be an hypothesis. And personally, I'm inclined to regard it as a myth. The main point that seems to unify the alleged components of a psychopath, lack of empathy, shallow affect, lack of motivation, impulsivity, seems to be a general sense that such people can't feel things that deeply. Shallow affect, or a perceived incongruence between what a person is expressing and the way in which they are expressing it, prompts the interviewer, if there even is a live interviewer, to assume that whatever the alleged psychopath says about their experience might not be true. If a psychopath says they have empathy, but their affect seems shallow, you might just not believe them. They have a deficit in profundity, which keeps them from experiencing important emotions like empathy and motivation. Personally, I say that this designation, as well as its DSM-recognized associate antisocial personality disorder, is a way of further dehumanizing people in the carceral system. No one has to feel bad about treating them with a complete lack of care and compassion while in a system that is already victimizing them. Further, personality disorders are determined by behavior. No one looks into the heart of a psychopath and sees that there's no empathy there. They judge that there is a lack of empathy based on behavior, and behaviors can be misconstrued. Among some, there is a vague sense that a sociopath is made while a psychopath is born, but the primary research in the subject has to do with how such people interact with the criminal justice system, not how their minds work in a vacuum. But I won't tell you what to believe. There are Ted Bundys in the world, after all. People for whom there truly seems no explanation other than a biological lack of empathy. But there's another reason we shouldn't haphazardly apply this idea to Azula. It has more to do with anachronism and the way we conceptualize the human mind differently based on time period and culture. Psychopathy, if it exists, would necessarily be a byproduct of the hyper-specific cultures that recognize it, even in the profoundly flawed DSM. We are reminded that disorders can only exist where symptoms are not better understood as normative for the individual's developmental stage of sociocultural environment. There are settings in which a lack of empathy would make one an exemplar amongst their peers, and in such environments, it would be odd to attribute this callousness to a biological defect or something innate to one's personhood. Rather, it would seem as though that person had developed appropriately based on the soil in which they were planted. You have to remember that Zuko's dreams of a society built on love and peace are extremely modern, and all of the individual steps he takes to fully glimpse this vision of the world pull him further away from the base assumptions at the heart of his upbringing. For instance, some people like to argue about whether Ozai ever loved his children, but if you're reading about the dynamics of fatherhood and rulership from a historical perspective, you can see that familial love isn't the same essential entity throughout cultures and periods. We don't know if Ozai ever had a paternal drive. He had children to continue his bloodline and avoid violent complications with succession after his death. That doesn't mean he hated his children, or even that he didn't feel emotionally affected by them. It just means that having children is something a prince needs to do. Look at the moment Zuko confronts Ozai about the cruelty of challenging a child to a duel.
How can you possibly justify a duel with a child?
It was to teach you respect.
The very notion that such an act can be cruel is entirely alien to Ozai. He genuinely believes he did the right thing. The fact that Zuko is traumatized by this event is the notable thing, not the fact that Ozai feels justified in his actions. Trauma only has the clinical significance that it does today because the effects of trauma are generally no longer helpful. It is in some ways a vestigial part of the human mind. We no longer need to live that way. In most places, we can emotionally afford to love our children and parents, and we get to pretend that this is a fundamental and essential part of our existence. But history bears out that that's not necessarily true. Zuko isn't good in comparison to Azula, who is bad. Rather, Zuko is morally exceptional in comparison to Azula, who is morally normal. I'm like retreating from the sun. Get away, son, you son of a bitch. You son of a bitch. Son of a bitch. Son? It's a homophone. I bring this up not just to show you that the psychopath reading of Azula is unrealistic. I can see it now. A comment saying, "Genius realizes cartoons are not real life. Groundbreaking." That's not the point. but thank you for engaging. You can also share this video with all your edgy big boy friends. I'm sure they would love to lol at it too, you know? You should actually just subscribe so you will know when I make another shitty take. Come on, I just made your life so much better with that suggestion. The point is that Azula being framed as a psychopath inherently flattens her character. It both dehumanizes her and disempowers us from understanding the society in which she was raised. It removes any ability to understand the world through her behavior because psychopaths aren't made, they're born. It takes away what her goals and motivations might say about the culture of her nation, because a psychopath wouldn't really care about a higher purpose. It even defangs the impact of her viciousness. If a psychopath lacks the motivation to plan for something, struggles with impulsivity, how can we possibly attribute Azula's successes to her brilliance, her formidability? It's simply an accident of the stars that she became as successful as she is. We don't see truth reflected in the psychopath, because the myth of the psychopath is a black hole where all thoughts of truth go to die. There is no human being in there, only a shallow affect. But, most importantly, it blunts the impact of the most dramatic arc in the story. It glosses over the fact that Zuko does something incredible by self-realizing in a way that is distinct from the culture in which he is born. Luckily, as I said, I don't believe that this reading is backed up by the text. So, why? Well, the biggest piece of evidence that I can see is that she certainly doesn't lack for motivation. A more psychopathic character would be portrayed as more of a bloodsucker. A more psychopathic Azula would probably use her power to loaf around, achieve nothing, and not really contribute to her family's success. But Azula is marked by her intense drive for success. Actually, it's more than success, isn't it?
Almost perfect. One hair out of place.
Almost isn't good enough.
Perfection. And that perfection is immediately contrasted with her fear of being imperfect. Wow. I have a lot of power. She's extremely confident and competent, a prodigy, but it is not just by providence that she is so talented and brilliant. It's the drive, and the drive away from something almost isn't good enough. In Azula's penultimate appearance before the finale, she is shocked and angered when her friends turn against her. This clearly shakes her, but not to the extent that she is out of control. She is still well within her limits of normal behavior. Some genuine emotion is present, but we can't quite put our finger on it. The finale rips this ambiguity apart. It's filled with fantastic Azula moments, and one of the most important lines of her characterization happens during a conversation with her father.
You can't treat me like this! You can't treat me like Zuko!
Wow, where did that come from? This is Azula in fear, real fear. The kind of fear that would cause her to snap at her father. She's terrified of being treated like Zuko. By the way, I'm borrowing this observation from a Tumblr user called Cobra Diamond. They've written a ton of essays on Azula that I really enjoyed, so I will be referencing them a lot. Cobra Diamond goes on to ask what being treated like Zuko means. And it seems like there are countless ways to answer that question while piling up on the anxieties Azula is expressing in this moment. Zuko is undeserving of attention, a weak liability to the family, the discardable one worth more dead than alive, a bleeding heart who lacks loyalty. Zuko has no worth in the Fire Nation in its current iteration. The fact that Zuko and Azula grew up to be so different can be attributed to their respective aptitudes with the skills of being a future Fire Lord. Azula was shrewd and regal and endlessly talented right from the beginning. She was therefore held up as her father's pride and joy. This drove her to be smarter, harder, and more worthy of the throne than Zuko. Zuko was therefore pushed to the side, so he often fell into the arms of his loving mother. Maybe he was also just a more sensitive child. We'll never know how much of who he is can be chalked up to nurture versus nature. But what's evident is that each was favored by one of their parents, and each parent went on to cultivate their own values in their favorite. Thus, Azula fits right in with her father, the fittest of his specimen, one who can screw over his own grieving brother, kill his own son, and conspire against his own father. Even assuming Iroh would have been a bloodthirsty and oppressive Fire Lord, Ozai was just better at it than him. Zuko, on the other hand, finds a home with the outsiders, first with his down-to-earth mother, and then with his disillusioned uncle. Finally, when Zuko is burned, humiliated, and exiled, Azula sees how this conflict between mom and dad shakes out. Ozai has the power, Ursa doesn't. Ursa loses the battle over her children's minds to a stronger and more ruthless opponent. Azula is given a very strong demonstration that her father's qualities will win out over her mother's. And that's done by showering her with adoration and respect and branding Zuko a pariah. And that's telling, isn't it? It isn't the risk-taking, callous Azula that finds herself as the outsider. It's the sensitive Zuko, who respects his father and stands up for patriotic soldiers. Are we really to assume that the Fire Nation is filled with unfeeling monsters who love destructive personalities? No, right? They're just people. They can all be normal, loving, empathetic human beings. So, how does someone like Azula become the prized gem of a nation of normal people? If she's in the inner circle and Zuko is the outcast, it would seem natural to assume that it wasn't Azula who is biologically bereft of goodness, but that there are standards and values in this society that contributed to the way Azula grew up. As we watch Azula being praised for her ruthlessness, it seems to me that we are not just being invited to understand Azula's mind, or even her family life. Rather, this sounds like an opportunity to understand her country. Perhaps, as a princess, and one who clearly aspires to great things, the nation is being personified through her. Maybe we can't understand Azula in a vacuum, and the qualities she prizes are also prized by her culture. Cobra Diamond wrote a fantastic piece on the cultural context in which Azula would have been raised. The Fire Nation is pretty clearly comparable to Japan, and Cobra Diamond expands upon just how deep this comparison runs. They speculate that, like Japan, the Fire Nation used to be a brutal congregation of warring fiefdoms trying to conquer the whole archipelago. Unlike in Japan, these warring fiefdoms could also shoot fire out of their hands. Not great for advancing a society, is it? So, at some point, one person conquered all the Fire Islands, enforced a unified government, and established a dynasty. The other three nations are all some flavor of decentralized, but the Fire Nation needed to be ruled with an iron fist, or the violence would continue to destroy their land and societal achievements every 15 years or so. To do this, the first Fire Lord immediately locked down the entire nation, suppressed any rival factions, and ensured that the main source of power, firebenders, were firmly under their control. If the central ruler of the nation wasn't a complete autocrat, they risked having to defend their claim in battle. It may seem cruel to execute anyone suspected of dissidence, or punish children for being weak, or conspire against your own family, but in the mind of such a ruler, these individual acts of violence are preferable to constant civil war. And this is the environment Azula grew up in. In fact, it's also the environment Sozin grew up in. Think about him for a moment. The supposed father of Fire Nation expansionism is sitting in the center of a dynasty that has transformed a dangerous, war-stricken land through enforced unity. As we see in The Avatar and the Fire Lord, Sozin's reign saw unprecedented peace and prosperity. Much like Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, baked into all layers of society was the underlying assumption that controlling potential enemies with strength and fear was the way to keep that security. Of course, eventually this manifested into an expansionist view. Sozin's plans of conquest were justified through talks of spreading prosperity, and this wasn't totally a euphemism. It was almost certainly a genuine thought, expressing the underlying mechanics of a conquest through an ideological filter. Suppression and peace are synonyms. It's not that Sozin was obscuring bad intentions with good ones. It's that conquest is a fundamentally good thing in his mind. Azula is of the generation with the most refined commitment to this assumption. Azula believes in what she refers to as the divine right to rule.
I can see your whole history in your eyes. You were born with nothing, so you've had to struggle and connive and claw your way to power. But true power, the divine right to rule, is something you're born with.
Which students of history will probably associate more with the Japanese emperor than with the shogun. You could even imagine that Azula's generation in the dynasty became even more perfect than its real-world reference ever became. The divine right to rule is something you're born with. I think this line alone provides a reason that you can't really pigeonhole Azula into contemporary understandings of antisocial behavior. Why is this the place her mind goes after achieving victory over her opponent? She doesn't brag about her brilliance or the many rewards that this success will bring her. It's this bitter utterance of the natural order of things and the way that it's been profaned. He's a commoner. He has no divine right to rule. He has almost affronted heaven with his actions. Why exactly does Azula climb so high? It seems almost obvious now. Power and domination are virtues in and of themselves. Her unique brand of intimidation, that ability to allow a calm smile to speak her capacity for brutality for her, it's a prized tool. As the princess of the nation, she is trying to exemplify the characteristics that it respects. To be like Zuko is to fail in her charge. When Ozai becomes a father, and when he becomes the Fire Lord, there is no underlying sadistic desire being realized through these accomplishments. They were accomplishments in the first place because they contribute to the perceived health of the nation, and this desire is inherently social, not antisocial. Likewise, as Azula is caught up in her downward spiral, she tells Lo and Lee that she will be the greatest leader in Fire Nation history.
But I will be the greatest leader in Fire Nation history.
This may be narcissistic, but again, it's not antisocial. It's hypersocial. She wants to go down in the books as someone who made her nation stronger and bigger and richer. At the very end of the show, Zuko declares that his dream for the Fire Nation is that it begins a new era of peace and love. Of course, this is completely contradictory to the values this nation has been taught. Peace and love are more dangerous than fear. They require trust and sacrifice. But because of the journey he's been on, he knows the real cost of the kind of prosperity that Sozin's Way offers. It may be less violent in terms of blood loss, but the violence lies in the negative spaces. The threat of punishment is latent violence. If you're quiet in the council meeting, you'll be okay. But if you speak a dissenting opinion, violence can be unleashed upon you. As a cog in the overwhelming war machine that is his nation, he knows that the violence is there. Azula does not. Not only is she exceptionally young, but she has only been shown through actions and rhetoric that her value is in her strength, and that the power of her position is fundamentally righteous. So yeah, Azula is a complex person with hidden depths. Her fears and desires are a natural manifestation of the kind of role she was taught to occupy. And so, we must look at the way her story ends. Azula finds herself disheveled, dissociated, and in uncontrollable tears. She's restrained and alone, abandoned by her father, the ultimate endower of worth in her life. And unlike her father, who concludes his final scene coherent and lucid, she's experienced an agonizing period of paranoia and psychosis. Disempowered, alone, and unloved, I can't help but see her as a victim in these final moments. So, what do we make of this? It's an ending so cold and bleak. We might assume it ought to be saved for the big bad. Even Jet was given a heroic moment in his final scene. Much virtual ink has been spilled trying to understand what a prospective Season 4 of ATLA might look like. And one of the things people agree would be fascinating to watch is an Azula redemption arc. And indeed, it seems that in a fair world, a world Zuko seems interested in building, Azula would grow into the kind of person who could appreciate this new method of social organization. After all, she's only 14. Iroh was much older than her and had much more blood on his hands by the time he began to think about his worldview. Iroh's line about Azula in Bitter Work has become iconic. She's crazy and she needs to go down.
And yes, he had just been shot in the heart by her. I get it. I'd probably want to kill her too. But, come on. Why did Iroh have to say this? Once Iroh says something, 99% of the fandom takes it as pure fact. What's more, the comics do a horrible job of honoring any semblance of humanity the finale gave her. Her hallucination of her mother, which happens in one tiny little scene, is blown up to overtake her entire presence on the page. It seems both Iroh and Bryke have no interest in exploring her humanity and offering her a way forward.
Sometimes, in retrospect, a good story can appear to be almost a naturally occurring event. The writer has little grasp on what they've made and how they've achieved it. It's hard to discount Azula's arc as entirely a mistake. It's a hell of a lot more interesting than Quidditch. Maybe Azula is forever destined to be a victim of her time and place. It was almost a cruel accident of fate that she just so happened to exemplify a culture that was in the process of falling just as she came into maturity. I, for one, would like to believe that Azula's goals and moral code changed as she got older. Maybe this moment of suffering will enrich her understanding of the world, the way Zuko's fight with Ozai did for him. And that's what I choose to take away from this story. Honestly, I think it's just as good as what the writers came up with.
This video topic was recommended by one of my viewers. You should do that too. I'm very tired. I'm sick again, as you can probably hear. My apologies for that. In my last video, I tried to explore the values held by the Imperial House of the Fire Nation in a way that granted their humanity. They belong to one of the best told stories in television history, after all. Shouldn't we at least try to understand them to be well written? So, assuming we want to read the best possible story into our understanding of them, let's try to get to know Ozai a little bit better. I've argued that our understanding of Azula could be enriched by analyzing her cultural context, and the same holds true for Ozai. Ozai is not essentially an abusive father and megalomaniacal supervillain. He's the apex of a political tradition spanning generations that has just about proven that enforced unity, brutally taking power for yourself and denying it to others, makes life more stable and society more prosperous. We would expect him to follow this logic in all parts of his life. For instance, it's not a coincidence or a consequence of convenience that his daughter overtakes Ba Sing Se in a bloodless coup. The fact that it's bloodless means that it's more efficient. The people who survived can serve the conquerors, and the Empire is less likely to incite rebellion if they don't kill too many people. Ozai is not a good person by our standards, but he wouldn't consider our standards to be particularly meaningful. He is a good ruler based on the standards that his family has proven are efficacious based on the ends that they want. Even usurping the throne from Iroh has no value to an antisocial leech with only malevolent intentions. He necessarily takes power for himself because he believes he can do good with it, even if his understanding of good is different than ours. Likewise, in this video, I want to invite you to politely set aside your most basic moral framework. I don't want you to forget your morals, that's important stuff, and we will be using that framework later. But I encourage you to bear in mind that those frameworks are made up and very contingent. And for the character that we're going to try to understand today, that framework might act like more of a cage. Alright? Alright. So, in 1889, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche had a nervous breakdown.
And they took Frederick to the asylum.
Like with most people who had mental health crises in the 19th century, no one knows the exact cause of this event. But sometimes, when a person so brilliant and illuminating is found plunging into the depths, we can't help but wonder if their ideas themselves push them over the edge. The will to power is an idea so terrifying and sublime, Nietzsche eventually gave up on the idea of writing it down. The book we have with that title was published posthumously by his sister, who was a total fascist, by the way. To summarize as best as I can, the will to power is the innate drive to progress. And I'm being intentionally vague with that word. The thing that urges on all forward momentum is the drive to struggle forward to become something more than what you are. Friedrich believed that people should pursue that which makes them suffer. Humans must fearlessly embrace the pain of life, and that will inevitably lead to ecstasy, revelation, apotheosis. In contrast, seeking comfort is a shortcut, a waste of life. One who attacks the insurmountable, pushes their limits, and expresses radical authenticity regardless of the consequences is an Übermensch, or Superman. And the person who seeks the comfortable, placid, unchallenging life is the last man. They take no risks, have no hope, and coast by in a haze of inert ennui. Through these intentional trials, people become something more than what they are. There is no essential human spirit. To be human is to always be becoming something else. My mind is drawing a parallel between the will to power and the theater of cruelty. Artaud's goal was to put actors and audiences through painful trials in order to induce a kind of mystical experience, where inert energy was unbridled, and the ennui of day-to-day survival melted into a dazzling, elevated plane of existence. A touch of death really brings out the fine notes of euphoria in modern life. Artaud once wrote the following on the work of Van Gogh. I will tell you that Van Gogh is a painter because he has reassembled nature, because he has, as it were, perspired it and made it sweat, because he has spurted onto his canvases in heaps, monumental with colors, the centuries-old struggle of elements, the terrible, rudimentary pressure of apostrophes, stripes, commas, and strokes, of which we must admit that, after him, natural appearances are made. I can't pretend that this deranged statement, appearing in an essay not 200 words away from an inexplicable description of a vagina cooked in green sauce and a penis of newborn child whipped and beaten to a pulp, doesn't make sense to me on a profound level. By the way, that mutilated genital imagery, it's the first sentence in that essay. I wish Artaud could make my thumbnails. Artaud here argues that fiction must not be an escape from reality, but a gateway into it, and the way through that gate is with pain. I think this elucidates Nietzsche's point. When Nietzsche describes the most fundamental drive in humankind, a person becoming more than what they are, he assumes a kind of self-craftsmanship that people exercise over themselves in order to realize a sort of truth that exists beyond cultural concepts of reality, in real reality. The will to power also makes me think of Freud's thoughts on the death drive. By its very nature, happiness can be no more than an episodic phenomenon. Any prolongation of a situation desired by the pleasure principle produces a feeling of lukewarm contentment. We are so constituted that we can gain intense pleasure only from the contrast, and only very little from the condition itself. There is something more important than survival, something that has to do with becoming something else through collision with that which is big, imposing, threatening, even fatal. And so, I appear to have contradicted myself. In my last video, we talked about the sociological context in which the Fire Nation became so authoritarian. The impulse to control a violent country with a unified hand is an act of cowardice. You want to end the violence before the violence ends you. Everything Azula does, I argue, affirms the virtue of strength in a country constantly on the edge of explosive violence. Azula and Ozai are strong so that fewer people have to suffer and die. So we got two opposing thoughts here. People grasp at power with shivering hands to protect themselves. And people crave power, because to become something more than what you are is to realize potential and seek the ultimate boon. So, which one's right? We're gonna answer that question by honing in on Ozai. I can't fully get behind the idea that Ozai is, in some way, cowardly or focused on self-preservation. The more I think about it, the less cowardice I see in Ozai's actions and presentation. The main reason I can't quite see Ozai as cowardly has to do with the way he interacts with and uses his children. Ozai uses his children to advance his reign in a way that doesn't feel protective and feels far from cautious. Ozai uses Azula as his main tool in the outside world, rarely leaving the palace himself, and he grooms Azula for leadership from a very young age. Not only does this indicate a disregard for traditional gender norms, old Fire Nation institutions like the Fire Sages are certainly less diverse, it also shows a commitment to quality and value over age. Passing the throne on to the eldest child of the sovereign is not an inherently good thing. It's the norm because it makes the transfer of power much less bloody if everyone knows who's supposed to take over as early as possible. Remember how easily Zuko slots back into the heir to the throne position in the early half of Season 3? Well, that's sensible. Ozai is glad that his firstborn son has proven his worth and restored his honor. It makes things a lot easier. These feelings are genuine.
I am proud of you, Prince Zuko. I am proud because you and your sister conquered Ba Sing Se. I am proud because when your loyalty was tested by your treacherous uncle, you did the right thing and captured the traitor.
But, throughout most of the story, Azula is the far more effective of the two siblings, and so even though Zuko is older, Ozai sticks with Azula. He sticks with Azula even though Zuko is the far safer option. Do you remember what got Zuko in trouble in the first place? Refusing to fight his father. Ozai burns Zuko on the face, and Zuko doesn't even strike back. Ozai banishes Zuko, and Zuko takes one of the most prolific and accomplished generals with him on the way out, and they don't try to attack Ozai. Zuko is much more docile than Azula, and much more eager to please him. I don't know about you, but I think I'd be the kind of king who keeps Zuko around and sends Azula out in the world to accomplish some ridiculously difficult goal. I'd keep the safe one nearby and the wild card as far away as I possibly could. Speaking of gender norms being disregarded, have you ever noticed that the Fire Nation is the most gender-integrated of the 4 nations in the original series? Well, there's some truth in that. Some of the most egalitarian civilizations in history have been peoples like the Mongols and the Vikings, pillaging, expanding, generally violent folks. Modern Mongols aren't violent. That's just, I'm talking about like Genghis era. Modern Vikings are very much cancelled, though. Isn't there an inherent danger to social egalitarianism that makes it all the more fascinating when it happens bloodlessly? Let's think about the shining pinnacle of cowardice that was slavery in the United States. Around the turn of the 19th century, Haiti experienced a slave rebellion that ended in a horrific massacre of the entire French population of the territory. This terrified a lot of people here in the United States, and it made the prospect of abolition seem unthinkable. Even as slavery began to hurt the economic interests of the northern states, we still had to fight the bloodiest war on our soil in order to stop it. And until this day, it's been unofficial government policy to keep the black population of the US as disempowered and terrified as possible, all in this obsessive fear of retribution for slavery. In contrast, Vikings and Mongols didn't have time to be so cowardly. Expansion is a difficult and time-consuming occupation. You have to be brave enough to allow those who are different from you, and may even have good reason to kill you, to wield power right alongside you. If you won't allow a woman to sail a ship, that ship isn't going anywhere. Likewise, Ozai doesn't hesitate to subvert common sense to achieve loftier goals. He doesn't try to stay safe. He'd rather seize an opportunity. By keeping the ambitious Azula nearby and branding Zuko untouchable, he spurs on Azula's drive even more and tries to cultivate his virtues in Zuko. He makes Azula even more volatile and dangerous. His entire relationship with Azula is a gamble. In the end, Ozai's biggest gamble, the decision that eventually leads to his downfall, is nominally an act of love. He brings Zuko back into the palace and lavishes him with attention and respect, all the things he always withheld from him. And he asks that Zuko sit at his right hand during a war council meeting. He won't even allow the meeting to begin until Zuko gets there. And it's because of this act of love that Zuko knows the information to prevent the Fire Nation from burning the Earth Kingdom to the ground. I already know that some people are going to take issue with me calling this an act of love. Stop typing. I'm acknowledging you, goddammit. If you remember from my last video, paternal love is not the same thing for everyone, and things like class, era, and culture all affect what familial love means and how it is demonstrated. Imagine you're Ozai. You grew up in a society where an appropriate punishment for taking advantage of your brother, who has just lost a son, is for your father to command you to kill your son. Where's the logic in that, Dad? What, you want 2 dead grandchildren? No. When Azulon commands Ozai to kill Zuko, he is expressing his love for Iroh and for Lu-Ten. That's the only reasonable explanation for this punishment. That might seem insane to you, as it does to me, but just remember, love is not some essential entity that exists out there in the nominal world. It manifests based on the priorities and preferences that we develop based on our culture. Zulon does need to show his nation that he values the rightful line of succession by defending Iroh's claim to the throne. But the desire to do this is a kind of love for Iroh. It's a paternal love. Remember, Ozai really is a better heir to the throne in this instance. His children are alive. That really matters in a hereditary monarchy. But the priorities of favoring your first child and offering them the care and the support they need to become a great ruler creates love in a society that values the line of succession as a thing that prevents violence. Azulon expresses a destructive desire in this moment, and that desire comes from a deep sense of who he is and what he believes in. The pillars of his reality demand this act of senseless violence. Likewise, Ozai is almost compelled to banish Zuko, because to teach him respect is to provide for him. It's a way of caring for him, supporting his heir. In a society where violence is seen as the way to protect your people, of course it can also be seen as an expression of love. I think it's interesting to note that Azula never feels threatened by Zuko in the first part of Season 3. Actually, we've never seen her this relaxed. She likes to luxuriate around the palace and make fun of her brother and hang out with her friends. Perhaps she's more or less convinced that the Avatar will show up and Ozai will realize that Zuko didn't kill him, but she also goes out of her way to warn him that his visits to Iroh are too obvious. She tells him at the end of Season 2 that she needs his help to conquer Ba Sing Se, and it seems like this was a genuine olive branch. And is this not also a form of love for her brother? This too is evocative of that whole network of ideas that we started this video with. Ozai loves his children in a way that he hopes will advance them and therefore advance the cause of the Fire Nation's war. I'll borrow a line from my last video. Zuko's understanding of his father's actions as cruel and wrong are extremely modern, and while I hope you're holding on to that moral framework and continue to love Zuko as much as I do, let's not pretend that our framework is the only one that exists. I want to remind you that just because we agree with Zuko doesn't mean that his father's concept of how a royal family should behave is completely twisted. I would argue that much of the way Ozai perpetuates the war could be seen through a similar lens, where things we consider bad could be justified in this Nietzschean worldview, because as much as this hurts to say, war involves some kind of societal advancement. We already spoke of the inherent bravery of egalitarianism, which is why I always bristle at the idea that the United States is the home of the brave. It especially upsets me when the most blindly patriotic of Americans believe in curtailing abortion rights to save life. Like, what happened to give me liberty or give me death? Aren't there more important things than that which meets the most literal definition of life? Whatever, that's a tangent for another video. That other video is actually 3 videos on my channel about The Handmaid's Tale. You should watch them. It seems to me that while the will to power is best applied to individuals, conquest involves a kind of self-movement and conscious self-craftsmanship as well. We know that the Fire Nation saw advancements in the technology of rulership between Sozin and Ozai. Sozin's throne is just a simple dais with a set of carpeted stairs leading up to it. By the time of his son's reign, Azulon is sitting behind a veil of flames in a room of dark, bloody reds. There are no steps. In his presence, you become untouchable. He has to enter from a different part of the palace, one that you don't have access to. Maybe even a celestial plane where the Fire Lord dwells. He's a mysterious, domineering, inhuman force. It also seems that Ozai's reign ushered in technology of the more mundane variety. Flying ships, gondolas, tanks, things that wouldn't have been possible without the conquest. After all, the Mechanist was not a subject of the Fire Nation. He became a collaborator because of the expansion. Ozai creates new things, or creates the ability for new things to be made, in order to destroy. And this ends up being a pretty integral part of his character in the finale. So, quick vibe check. How's your moral framework doing? Good, good. I'm gonna need you to take off one more framework for me, if that's cool. The critical framework that balks at anything too shonen anime-ish. Yeah, I'm gonna need you to just take that one off too. It's only gonna get in the way for this next part. So, in the series finale, Ozai decides to burn down the world and declare himself the Phoenix King, because the new world will be reborn from the ashes of the old one. Even in context, it's a little too shonen for me. But we're taking this seriously. Stick with me, lads. Calling himself the Phoenix King effectively destroys the role of the Fire Lord and advances him into a new stage of development. He gives up the throne and puts himself in an immensely vulnerable position by being in the front line of this battle. He even single-handedly takes on the Avatar in one-on-one battle. It's a ridiculous act of hubris that a guy as sensible as Ozai never would have taken if not for this tradition of Fire Lords pushing past their perceived limits of power. Intuitively, I feel a sort of connection with these ideas and sentiments, and there are ways in which a society can appropriately follow these principles, pushing past what is strictly needed for survival, and using the safety of a community to give humanity the tools to think new thoughts, create wonders, and make happiness. Those are things that a society should do. Those are things that a government should do. So that's why the Fire Nation is the greatest country to ever be conceived of, ever. It's literally perfect. Real quick, grab your moral framework, just put it back on. Yeah, you're gonna need it for this next part, because we're about to talk about why the Fire Nation is fucking bad at all this. Yeah, I've been lying to you. The Fire Nation is doing a bad job. Yes, a society with the ambition of the Fire Nation does appeal to me, but the problem is a classic one. The ambition is saved for the utopians sitting around in war rooms telling other people to die for your stupid project. In fact, it is completely inaccurate to call the Fire Nation ambitious. A nation is composed of people, not just an administration. And the way the administration of the Fire Nation cultivates the kind of people it needs to achieve its goals is to shackle them to stifling enforced societal norms that prevent personal growth beyond a person's ability to recite a national oath. The headband gets a lot of shit for being inspired by Footloose, but it gives us a good glimpse into the actual world being created by these Ubermenschen in Ozai's palace. Kids need to go to school in the Fire Nation. Hey, that sounds like a societal advancement. But if they misbehave, including dancing to music, they can just be sent to a coal mine. They aren't being encouraged to tackle obstacles to their own personal goals to achieve happiness. They're being molded into fodder who can advance the project of rich fucks who want to gain power over other people so they can turn them into fodder too. In the end, Ozai would be a huge disappointment to Nietzsche. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is about a great man who develops into a state of near perfection by living in isolation from the rest of the world. But he grows weary of his solitude and decides to share his wisdom with the rest of the people. He gains disciples and teaches them to create their own meaning and values. Zarathustra promotes a kind of moralist anarchism. The belief is that people don't need a strict set of laws to control their every behavior. Every human being should be responsible for crafting their own system of values and adhering to them.
I cannot believe we are so poorly made as that. Incapable of surviving in the state to which we were born. Grown so used to the yoke that there can be no progress without it.
In the end, Zarathustra leaves his disciples multiple times because he decides that he can't lead them. He's not a god. God is dead. Didn't you know? What fascinates me about this topic is that I still don't understand why Ozai wants the things he wants. There is a Viking somewhere in Ozai's moral code. I think he wants to die in battle and better himself by conquering the rest of the world and subjugating them to his will. I believe that he has internalized the ideas of his ancestors who wanted to create peace through unity, and that naturally developed into a personal sense that expanding the empire is to become something greater than he is now. But a truly brave person takes that capacity for violence and subjugation and turns it inward. They learn how to cultivate themselves, and because they are a human being, such a person necessarily wants other human beings to be able to pursue this kind of profound self-actualization too. They don't strip anyone under their control of the tools needed for self-reflection the way Ozai does. It's so tragic to me that Ozai's only acts of love that we ever get to see are when he exposes Zuko to immense transformational suffering. When he banishes Zuko, he does make him something greater than what he was before, and suffering was his teacher. This horrible act of cruelty is all the love Ozai can muster for a child he made. If you can't enjoy the simple pleasure of caring for your own child and getting to know them on their own terms, if that's not a transformational experience for you, I don't think conquest is going to be either. Ozai is a broken person, caught in a fatalistic loop of diverted self-actualization where no real progress can be made and no genuine connection truly felt. If you think that Ozai is a cartoony villain, I totally get that. It does sort of seem like the human being inside him liquidated into this homogeneous, destructive slop. But in a way, there is truth in that too. Ozai is not an Ubermensch. Zuko is.
A few months ago, I made a video defending live-action Katara from unjust criticism. Now, I return to the smoldering ashes of the live-action discourse battlefield to remind you that my Avatar commentary, while often in conflict with the community at large, is only slightly less good than everyone else's. When I say I don't like live-action Zuko, I'm using him as a synecdoche for the Fire Nation in general. Because the fact is, the entire antagonistic force behind this series is a deflated mass of useless slop. Its formidability is backed up by nothing but the inert sentimentality inherent to these emotional cliches that we've seen a million times before. And that's what Katang is for. Come on, Fire Nation, the bar isn't that high. It's not just Zuko. The entire Fire Nation is just bizarrely adapted. Today, I kind of just want to hang out and show you a couple examples of how deeply bad this presentation is.
No, Fire Lord Ozai, you're not wearing pants.
I'm lumping Sozin and Ozai into one character here, because honestly, they might as well be. There's a persistent problem in Netflix's Avatar with the stakes not feeling high enough. The antagonists don't feel dangerous or cruel enough to sustain the kind of drama Avatar calls for. And no single element of the show exemplifies this problem more than the way it deals with the Fire Lord, the office, the persona, the force of national will that the Fire Lord represents. Despite the fact that Sozin and Ozai are now big fans of the old setting people on fire technique, they are far less intimidating in this iteration. In fact, the Fire Lord should not be doing horrific acts the second they get on camera. That completely deflates all of the fear. In my last video, I talked about the technology of rulership, advancements that the Fire Nation made to the whole conceit of the Fire Lord that heightened their danger and mystique. Of course, the decision to not show Ozai's face until Season 3 wasn't necessarily practical in a live-action setting. It would feel far too conspicuous. But there are other aspects of the Fire Lord's presentation that make them intimidating that can absolutely be rendered threatening in live action. The raised dais with no steps leading up to it, the veil of flames in front of the throne, the strict control they maintain over conversations in the war room, the ability to make horrific commands to their subjects, such as Azulan telling Ozai to kill Zuko. It's not just monarchical. We see the Earth King in his palace, but the tone is very different. The fact that he doesn't seem involved in the goings-on of the political realm, he doesn't seem to put much thought into his presentation, that changes everything. The Fire Lord would never allow someone like Long Feng into the ranks of their inner circle, you just know it. But, in the live-action adaptation, the Fire Lord reads as more of a modern drug lord. This isn't the most powerful hereditary ruler in the world, this is Walter White. Dangerous because of what he and his goons can do, not because of the power they represent or the environment they foster. By the way, I liked Daniel Day Kim. The guy has a legacy in the Avatar universe, and it was really lovely to see him get a prominent role. But most of his lines are just so awkwardly written.
Is this everything? Give me everything!
Jesus, look how flat these throne room scenes are. The Fire Lord shouldn't be standing in the throne room. They shouldn't be meeting with the stupidest group of insurrectionists who ever lived, and they absolutely should not be raising their voice in their own war meeting to be heard.
You dare question—
Enough!
Ozai feels more like a mean teacher from Harry Potter rather than the big bad of the show. And why is the princess busting a coup on her own? That's so pathetic. It makes it seem like the Fire Nation is a group of like 500 people. Why does Ozai even talk to these morons? It would be one thing if he thought there might be more of them and wanted to get more information out of them, but he just burns them alive. For that matter, why doesn't Azula just kill them all instead of playing dress-up and leading them directly into the palace? God damn it, Azula, why are you so lame in this version? Speaking of which...
You're a class act, sister. Sister thought I missed her.
In the show's effort to create more complexity for big kids, they've uncovered the inner workings of the Fire Nation's value system. And in the uncovering, they've flattened it. Anyone reading between the lines in the original show can tell you that Ozai plays Azula and Zuko off each other. For more on that, I did 2 whole videos on the subject. You should watch them. But the Netflix show can't let you work that out on your own. You can't be left to your own literary devices, silly goose. By the time you came to that conclusion yourself, you'd have already written a 10,000-word Tumblr meta on how toxic this show is for not calling out Ozai's abusive methods. You see the conundrum they're in. Do people still say toxic? I'm 30 now, I'm not a people anymore. So, they just push Ozai's psychological manipulation of his children directly into your face as soon as possible. And I get it, I'm terrified of Tumblr too. But the way Ozai orchestrates the competition between his kids turns that conflict into a season-long arc, rather than an environmental detail that tells us about his values, the values of his family, and the values of his nation. Is giving Azula an arc in the first season a good move? I'd argue no. A character arc necessarily exposes weakness. It pokes holes in the subject's belief system. And as we discussed, the Fire Nation already feels pretty weak. It's run by like 10 people tops. Azula's final shot, where she is shown to be leading her own troop, comes at the end of a season's worth of watching a child beg and struggle for her dad's approval. The most impressive thing we've seen her do is befriend Zhao, in an attempt to knock Zuko off their father's pedestal, as she sees it. Her climactic moment is her refusing to fight 5 people, whom she requested, if you remember, and then slowly and laboriously producing a thread of lightning and then shooting it away from her dad after he attacks her, which to me sounds like what Zuko did in their Agni Kai, but whatever. There are attempts to make her more dangerous, but I mean, do you feel afraid of her? I don't know, she's just not the malevolent, brilliant force of nature that animated Azula was. It would be one thing if this character arc made her feel destabilized, like a Jinx character, an out-of-control menace with limitless political and physical power unleashing her raw fury on the world due to inner turmoil. But she doesn't feel like that. No shade to Elizabeth Yu, I think she does her best with some really bad writing choices.
There are always ways to get in the game, if you know which pieces to play.
That's not how games work. I can imagine a counter-argument going something like this. Shain, you're hugging too close to the original story. Sure, they cut to the chase and give Azula her pathos a little bit earlier, but maybe they have to demonstrate Azula's insecurities early in order to set up a poignant story that we might not be expecting as viewers of the original. There may be some incredible story potential that we haven't seen yet that needs this kind of meticulous setup, and that might retroactively make this arc more interesting. And here's my response to that. First of all, wow, I can't believe you know my name. I've been a fan for so long. I'm honored. But also, this amazing story potential hasn't come to anything over an entire season. So what does it matter if it will eventually be interesting if all of her season 1 scenes are a slog to get through? Azula didn't need to be in season 1. OG Azula makes 2 brief non-speaking appearances in book 1 before taking center stage as book 2's main antagonist. This story was fabricated out of fan speculation on the part of the writers. They clearly love Avatar and wanted to show what Azula might have been going through in book 1, leading to her being unleashed onto the world stage in book 2. But I have to say, I don't feel like I understand her better. As I talked about in my Azula video, her desire to rule says something about her that cuts to the heart of the values the Fire Nation instills in its people. This Azula speaks only for herself, and the message is, my dad is a villain. Groundbreaking.
Yeah, hi, it's Bill Lumberg again.
I like Zhao. That's it. I just think he's hilarious. Every time he's on screen, he's either giving Bill Lumberg middle manager realness.
Prince Zuko, what an honor to welcome actual royalty to our humble base. What can I do for the Crown Prince?
Or he's almost frighteningly enthusiastic in his attempts to make this boring-ass dialogue good-ish.
Celebrate!
Seriously, I know that sounded like a backhanded compliment, but Ken Leung does a really good job making Zhao feel like a Weasley cog in the machine that can put on a reverent tone or cry crocodile tears on command. He's funny in a way that feels really intentional. That scene where he's putting on a big show of cursing those fiends who killed Zuko, it should feel ridiculous. He's in the middle of a scene where 2 people are, in earnest, essentially playing make-believe about how Zuko pretend died. It should feel ridiculous. It should feel silly. Sometimes politics is really silly, especially in this show. No problems with Zhao. All done.
I'll let it pass because your dad's kind of cute.
I'm of 2 minds about live-action Iroh. On the one hand, I think Paul Sun-Hyung Lee kills it in just about every scene he's in. And he particularly brings out the strengths in Dallas Liu's performance of Zuko. His chemistry with Lee is just fantastic. They work off each other really well for comedy, drama, action. Even their low-stakes scenes together just feel good to watch.
The plan is to reclaim what's rightfully mine!
So no plan?
I'm working on it, Uncle.
He says your vision will be fine, which means you have the good fortune of continuing to bask in my beauty.
I don't know anything about acting, so you can correct me if this doesn't make any sense, but it feels like Lee really gives Liu a lot of space to, like, find a way to express who Zuko is in a way that feels authentic to him. Like, I feel like Lee really kind of goes out of his way to match Liu's tone and energy. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. I don't know. I was Glinda in a first grade production of Wizard of Oz, and that was the last, like, interaction with acting I had, so. I tried to get up on the stage, but everyone was, like, sitting on the steps, so I just, like, swung my little, like, 6-year-old leg over and, like, pulled myself over, and everyone laughed at me. And I think this dynamic between the actors really makes a lot of sense. Iroh does meet Zuko where he's at, in both iterations of the story. Zuko's a volatile teenager with a hair-trigger temper, and Iroh is a calming, supportive presence that wants to give Zuko the space to figure his shit out on his own. On the other hand, Iroh's writing is just
really disappointing. He lacks a lot of the attributes that makes OG Iroh special. Despite some superficial attempts to make him seem like the wise, crafty old statesman that he is in the original, this Iroh just doesn't seem very bright. Here's a bunch of examples of that. Iroh blames Ozai for Zuko's murder in front of Zhao. Ozai being the Fire Lord of the authoritarian nation he's a subject of. If Zhao were a smart character, he would have seen through this immediately. This is a treasonous statement, and he's making it to someone who is a really high-ranking official in the Fire Nation army. It also doesn't make sense. Why would the Fire Lord need to do a covert assassination? Ding. Iroh straight up tells Zuko's crew to commit mutiny after they've just said, "We're not going to commit mutiny for this little shit." Just asks again, but with more righteous indignation. Maybe a different tactic is in order? OG Iroh is way more fluid and cunning, and frankly, he doesn't care much about propriety and honor. He's too practical to tell people to act on higher principles. Iroh's method of getting people to come around to his way of seeing things has to do with being open and responsive to others, not prescribing how they should be acting in any given moment. And when he does do that, he fails. For more on that, see my video on Iroh's mistakes. I've made a lot of Avatar videos. You're welcome. He's humble and open to other points of view. That's actually how he gets the crew to ease up on Zuko in the original series.
I mean, who does Zuko think he is?
Do you really want to know?
General Iroh, we were just...
It's okay. May I join you?
He meets people where they're at, rather than telling them to meet him wherever the hell he is. Ding. This Iroh also just seems much more sheltered than our boy. You don't get that sense that he's traveled the world and seen the way people live. And he seems to have no concept over the ridiculous amount of privilege he's had over just about 99.99% of people.
And he knows far more about sacrifice than you can ever know.
Fuck you! You have no idea what this kid has been through. Like, are you kidding me? Is being burned on the face literally the worst thing you can think of? Because that is horrific, but we have every reason to believe that that is the kind of treatment that every child in the Fire Nation is subjected to. If a prince growing up in a palace can be subject to that treatment, how do we think a kid in the army can be treated?
And he knows far more about sacrifice than you can ever know.
Try to understand. My nephew is a complicated young man. He has been through much.
This Iroh hasn't lived in the world. We get the sense that he's just as naive as Zuko. Look at this gentle, "Okay, Grandpa," the lieutenant gives him.
If anything, Zuko cares too much, especially about the people on this ship. Of course, sir.
Iroh's dogged loyalty to Zuko isn't helpful when Zuko clearly doesn't know what he's doing. Beyond this, new Iroh has no sense of remorse for the harm he's caused, and that's just so miserable to have to sit through. In Winter Solstice, where Iroh gets captured by Earth Kingdom soldiers, he is treated more or less amiably, his enemies conducting themselves with a sort of detached, gentlemanly pragmatism. When Iroh's insulted, he plays up the failed old general conceit, using it as an opportunity to slip off the ostrich horse and plant a trail for Zuko. The situation is changed quite a bit in the live-action version. Iroh is repeatedly brutalized by an Earth Kingdom soldier, automatically framing the soldier in a bad light. Sure, he has a sad story that validates his anger against Iroh, but you can't viscerally get behind him because you're watching a young person slapping and punching a tied-up older man. Iroh then throws out this comment:
War pushes us to the edge. Some of us don't like what we find there.
Is that your pitiful way of saying you're sorry for what you did?
I wasn't talking about me.
And that clinches it. Iroh got in his zinger, and the man's very real grievances can just be dismissed. How is Iroh ever gonna help Zuko become better if he seems to have no grasp on the moral stain on his own character? Oh, I forgot. This is the Netflix adaptation. No one is allowed to learn anything from anyone else.
You're looking at her.
You may notice that a lot of these instances involve Iroh being so blinded by his love and devotion for Zuko that he just spits out any stupid take that he thinks will get people to do what he wants. And yeah, Iroh isn't the only one giving Zuko too many props too early on. The writers are doing the same thing, and both Iroh and Zuko's character arcs are skewed as a result. Which brings us to the man of the hour.
Instead of lightning, it keeps exploding in my face! Like everything always does!
Zuko is downright loved by just about everyone in this series. Azula is constantly being made to feel inferior to Zuko. Even though he's been exiled, there's a palpable sense that he's still the standard to which Azula needs to judge herself. The way Ozai constantly seems to be on Zuko's side makes the exile feel sincerely like an act of love, even more painful for Ozai than for Zuko himself. Even the scene where Ozai burns his face is oddly tender. Ozai holds Zuko's hand over his heart and looks like he's near tears. When Zuko is in recovery, Ozai implies that he made a mistake by not giving Zuko the opportunity to get tough. He's made a mistake. That's so radically different from the point of view of the original Ozai, who views Zuko's banishment as him cutting out the weak link in the chain. And yes, as I've mentioned before on this channel, I do believe that there is an argument to be made that Ozai banishing Zuko could be interpreted as an act of love. But think about that word, mistake. This Ozai feels responsible for Zuko being so soft-hearted. We're left with no idea about how Ozai raised Zuko. Has he been a dismissive, distant parent, as suggested by the things he says during their fight, or the way he insults him during the war meeting? Or is he a doting parent trapped in the social position of a person who doesn't believe he can be that? This affects Zuko's characterization too. This Zuko has prospects in the Fire Nation, and he's aware of this. He's less desperate than animated Zuko. This iteration of Zuko is marked by his aversion to upending the social order, his reluctance to break rules, and his concern for ensuring everyone respects the strict class hierarchy of the Fire Nation. He's embarrassingly straightforward.
Word is, Zhao failed his officer training program 3 times.
Did I ask for your opinion?
He was only trying to help.
He was gossiping about a superior officer. There is an order to the way we do things here. Rules. We are Fire Nation. Even out here.
He can't even whine as well as our Zuko.
I'll send some men to investigate.
No! I'll have to do it myself. As always.
Dude, are you their mom or something? Put some oomph into it.
You'd better learn some respect, or I will teach it to you.
There we go. Generally speaking, this Zuko knows he's going home. His goal isn't to get his father's love, but to fulfill the commandment of his king so he can inherit the throne. He says as much in episode 1.
It'll all be worth it once I return home in glory to take my place as the rightful heir to the Fire Lord.
Perhaps it's time to consider that the throne isn't everything.
It may not have been for you, but for me, it's my destiny.
You can plainly see his priorities and all of the things he's not willing to do. Judge for yourself. Animated Zuko jumps off the bridge of a metal ship a good 30 feet in the air. This guy waits a full minute before shooting the world's slowest fireball and then just watches it. How on earth is this listless goody two-shoes the blue spirit? Desperation is essential to Zuko. Desperation is what makes him good. So thoroughly good that he can withstand all the temptations of acquiescence to the Fire Nation's norms and brave the punishments for going against it. Big Joel makes a great point in his video about the Netflix remake. Zuko doesn't stand up for the 41st Division with knowledge of the consequences. His naivete tells him that the world will work right, that his father will do the right thing, if only he shows him the right path. He's a child, stating what he knows to be right in the face of adults who have become too jaded to see the truth. This is the quintessence of Avatar tragedy. When Zuko 1.0 is punished for this act, he gets his first taste of a political backlash. Not just his father making him feel awful, but his king executing a judgment on him. And for a long time, he can't even come close to making that mistake again, because the consequences were just too brutal. It's really frustrating that this Zuko is both more loved and protected in this version, and yet he's also receiving accolades for accomplishing things he hasn't done yet. The writers clearly love Zuko. Yeah, everyone loves Zuko. But I gotta tell you, this scene was the moment I realized I did not like this show. Folks, anyone telling you this scene gave them all the feels is suffering from fandom-induced psychosis, and they may be entitled to financial compensation. Zuko didn't put his neck out for these people. He spoke up in a meeting that he was, by the way, invited to speak at, and clearly didn't understand what the consequences of his actions would be. Of course, because he was a child. He isn't Jesus on the cross. He hasn't even done any of the basic Season 1 nice Zuko things that original Zuko did. This lovely scene, where Zuko saves the helmsman, shares a quiet smile with the lieutenant, foregoes chasing Aang to get the crew to safety, and apologizes to Iroh, is a genuine moment of revelation for the audience. But if the entire crew started bowing to him, we would all vomit. Not to mention, this comes on the heels of Zuko's Blue Spirit adventure, where he both sabotages his nation's goals and then attacks a child. Why is this the moment to start bowing? He has done less than nothing. Make him earn his goddamn redemption. So, yeah. I didn't like this adaptation very much in general, and I think the Fire Nation was the weakest part of it. Zhao excluded, I think every character in the Fire Nation is fundamentally broken, both as characters in a new story and as altered iterations of old characters done for a new stage. I hit Bernie Sanders in the face. And altogether, these weak characters have the effect of making the Fire Nation seem fragile to the point of being unthreatening. Iroh is already willing to commit treason for Zuko. Zuko is stuffy and unthreatening, far more concerned with maintaining the appearance of propriety and competence than with clawing his way back into his father's good graces with any means at his disposal. And Ozai is just a fucking mess. The fact that the rest of the world has not crushed the invasion and Treaty of Versailles, the Fire Nation, really speaks to, like, the incompetence of the rest of the world, rather than, like, the formidability of the Fire Nation. All this to say, I didn't particularly enjoy the new show. Not as a fan of the original, and not as an eager viewer of new content. But hey, I'm sure it'll get better. This video is brought to you by me. You're welcome. I think about stories a lot. Almost constantly. I'm not sure where I am right now. Point is, if you're writing a story and you need some help, you can hire me. I consult on screenplays, write serialized fiction, and yes, I write scripts for YouTube professionally. That's right, you're looking at a pro. Don't check my sub count. You can go to my website to check out my portfolio, read my reviews, look at my prices, and reach out for a chat about how I can help with your project.